and MIT. Drew's work explores how architecture can translate cultural identity across contexts with a focus on contextual intelligence, adaptive reuse, heritage conservation, and urban regeneration. Operating globally from London and Paris, the practice leads projects across Europe, Australia, the Middle East, and more recently, India. Alongside practice, Amrita lectures, writes, and teaches internationally. Amrita.
I always have to do this. Thank you to everybody for having us here today. Thank you to Smaran, Bijoy, Aruna, Sunita, and Sujit for arranging this. We're really very grateful. It's been a very interesting couple of months for us because a city that I was familiar with somewhat has become an enormous part of our lives, and we've been spending a lot of time here over the last few months, and it's made it's sort of really become a very special part of our current lives. So I just a quick introductions, but so Drew was set up by myself and Michelle about 14 years ago now, and I think today I'd like to talk about inheritance. I purposely did not choose the word heritage because heritage implies that there's a sort of unanimous agreement that there is inherent value in what we inherit. Inheritance, on the other hand, is something we get whether we like it or not, and it comes with a very cognizant act of choosing to accept that inheritance. And for us, the way we see it, where it sits distinct from an architectural practice that might be one of conservation in a more in a historical sense, the act of inheriting and acting on it is for us a very contemporary act of architecture. It's a contemporary practice of architecture, and one that comes with lots of challenges and often can be very awkward. And it's in that space that we've actually found our work to be most interesting. So in that space where often what we're inheriting is in immense strata of cities that have layers and layers of their own histories. They come with political challenges, they come with economic variations and vast complex social cultures and demographics of so many different really cosmopolitan environments that we can't really distill it down to being a simple act of participating in architecture as a kind of linear process. For us, this is something that we're returning on over and over again in our work, and we find that that awkward space of having to navigate and dialogue with what we inherit in that strata is really what we find most interesting in our work. So today I will be speaking about a selection of projects where we sort of demonstrate through our work how we are dialoguing. And as I mentioned earlier, almost all of our work is in cities. So cities which are oscillating between these challenges of what we preserve and how we innovate. So they're moving between challenges of rapid growth and preservation. And we're often having to consider, cities that are often having to consider how they retain civic life despite of economic pressures to sort of give up what would be considered public space or the public agora. We're often facing challenges of retaining patina because we value it, but also creating texture because we see that there's a certain thinness that is emerging out of the industries within which our disciplines operate, and so finding ways to recreate that sense of texture, and recognizing that our construction industries are also going through vast changes, and knowing where, in a sense of climate responsibility and for all sorts of economic reasons, how we build and what we build with is also part of that dialogue. And it impacts everything from typology, from scale, and in a number of ways at the tectonics within which we work. And then something that we've found particularly important over the course of the years that we've been working is co-authorship. So the idea that actually most architectural practices today do not sit isolated within our ivory towers. A lot of our work takes place as a dialogue with communities, through exhibition, through consultation, and through kind of generating a public awareness throughout the course of not only a project, but throughout the course of our careers, actually. So working a lot with younger children and school-going people who are outside of the discipline for the moment, but raising awareness of what they see and how they understand what they see. And so within this strata, we've been working to effectively, by chance or by accident, we're almost inheriting some sort of landscape that isn't the ground, and we're always finding that many of our projects are having to navigate that space as a dialogue with our histories. And that is what we particularly find interesting, what we find challenging, and what's allowed us to, we hope, sort of create works that are relevant and are open enough to know that they themselves will change in time. So we've been thinking about this as an idea for the last 5 to 6 years, some of it through teaching, some of it through writing, a lot through lectures and talks, but we've sort of come to a theoretical sort of conclusion, which we call the ugly plan. So the ugly plan is an analogy for a project which is synthesizing critically its conflicting contexts in a way that do not try to distill something. Clarity is important, but it's not our sole objective. So we're thriving in that complexity, and it's something that we're embracing more and more in the work we do. So I prefer to speak through it by example because it's always easier within the discipline. So this is Campiello Morosini, which is a public square in Venice. The square has almost no real recognizable shape. It's something that has been constructed over time through a series of interventions. Each was a very conscious act of authorship that involved constructing a series of facades, creating the sense of an urban container or a room, and from any vantage point, what you see is an urban whole, not a part of something larger. And so, in a way, every part of this square is progressively acting on its immediate surrounds and giving and creating a sense of dialogue, but almost all of it has been authored like a chess game in partnership with the moments that, like the authors that preceded those that came after. So there's a sort of dialogue that is consistently happening between every corner or facade or vantage point, and you recognize that as you move through it. And this is the sort of, I guess, ugly plan that we aspire to in our work, because we recognize that our work is very rarely benefits from the luxury, I may suggest, of a site where we don't touch something else. We are always hard up against a wall, rubbing up against a neighbor, always in dialogue with 3, 4, 5 streets. And in some ways, city building has actually that sort of recognition that city building comes from constantly participating in creating something that is in dialogue with a neighbour or with a past or with a future has allowed us to really think through the work we do in a theoretical way. So I'll begin by explaining some of our projects. This is the Town Hall, the Town Hall Hotel in Bethnal Green. The building was built in the late 19th century and then had a series of extensions which took place during the pre-war period. And we began our work by doing, so it was originally constructed as a town hall, and through a consolidation of London boroughs, the public assets were beginning to be sold, and there was, so this is, now almost 10 years ago, but there was a series of consolidation exercises during to reduce costs for administrations, and so they started selling public assets. And those public assets became available to private developers, which were quite valuable at the time because these are very difficult buildings to get hold of, but they also come with a number of refurbishment challenges as you think about moving them from one type of use, which was purely administrative, into something that is meant for other programming. So our client purchased the site with a view to create a hotel, conference facilities, and various other restaurants and other spaces. But there was also this clear public-private agreement with the council that we would not be, that the building had to maintain a certain level of public function and remain open to the public for timed purposes. So there could be timed events, it could be reused by the council for civic purposes, etc. And so there was already an agreement in place that was negotiated, and then there was the question of designing for that solution. So our work began with an immense amount of archival research on the condition of the building, understanding the original design intents, looking at the extensions which had already taken place during the pre-war period, so during the 20s and 30s, and then effectively collating all of this archival research so that we knew where we were beginning and knowing how we would effectively reinstate what needed reinstatement as a pure act of conservation, and then knowing when we were going to act in a more contemporary, act sort of with contemporary architecture to distinguish the chapters between different eras and make sure that we made visible the new chapter that we were adding to it. Now, we inherited the building in a very dire state of abandonment, so it had been used somewhat for film sets, but there was a lot of water ingress, a number of rooms were just some rooms were okay and could have been preserved to some extent, but others, were really falling apart. And so a lot of our work began through actually doing careful inventory and scans for reproduction of the same plasterwork or the scagliola, which is a painted marble. It's a sort of an Italian artwork, and then and various other components that required refurbishment. But that process of inventory actually was, it almost was the immense amount of research and analysis that went into those phases had a huge amount of influence on the way that we then went on to design. Because we could already see within the building layers and layers of history. We could see the 80s, the 70s, the 50s, the various components had emerged and parted and things had been refurbished and then disregarded again. And so bringing buildings of this nature up to sort of bringing them forward into our contemporary times where we need to sort of meet certain criteria by code, by fire, by just sort of introducing new services and thermal performance in these buildings can often be a really challenging exercise because everything is listed, every door handle, every tile, every piece of plaster that is no longer there but was there some time ago. And so that exercise for us began, and which is often the case, is actually reintroducing new extensions because the only way to make projects like this entirely financially viable is to be able to create an uplift on the amount of, oh, sorry, something, I have done something that I should not have, for which I would need help. Sorry. I think I know, that's okay. Thank you. So there are often these challenges which come then with the requirements for an extension to ensure that there's a commercial viability. And actually something that's really interesting with the UK is that often projects, the government will only allow for a planning permit to be granted when a commercial viability or a business statement is provided with it, that they know that the project will survive the construction phases and make sure that it opens and that we meet our promises effectively. And those are, it quite changes the way we think about conservation, because it means that not only are we thinking about it as a pure act of architecture, but we're also constantly in dialogue with the kind of commercial requirements of a project to know that, you know, if we want to ever see it, is it not? Mm-hmm. See, I have done something wrong. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, part of that process is also commercial viability, and it began with figuring out how we would first, how we would effectively create extending volumes for the site, but also look at how we would completely revisit a densification of its floor plan, its numerous floor plans to create, to introduce the various programs that were now coming in. So where it was obvious to sort of be able to break certain rooms up, which had formerly been offices, etc., those were straightforward exercises, but we often also had rooms which were completely unsuited to transformation into anything like a hotel room, and we had to be really creative about how we approached those spaces. There was a huge amount of enabling works which took place, which were to conserve what could be conserved for further mapping and reuse. And then exercises in pure conservation as well. We went through archives that allowed us to recover details like this former clock, which we found in photographs but no longer existed in the building, was remade, and these were more pure acts of conservation. But we took an approach to the idea of a hotel as something that could almost be an experience of theatre rather than dividing the rooms up into individual spaces that would create walls and separate the spaces. What we wanted to do was effectively look at ways in which all of the functions that were required for it to work as a hotel room could be consolidated into this space furniture, which are these platforms that we introduced into these large volume rooms. These rooms were completely listed down to skirt boards and trims and everything. So any kind of strategy would have been a loose fit from the walls. So we knew that we were going to have to create objects within the space or boxes within boxes. And we took this particular approach because we felt that it also tested the public and suggested that, you know, people might think more creatively when they're in a hotel as opposed to the way we might choose to stay where we live, that you can accept a scenario where you're actually on some sort of podium stage for sleeping, bathing, using a bathroom, etc. It also allowed us to really think through the reversibility of the building, which was very important because at any future time, we might find ourselves in a position where we don't, the building is sold again and we cannot retain it as a hotel. And so part of our strategy was entirely built on these ideas of reversibility. So any air conditioning and ventilation and plumbing were coming from below, and we knew that we could remove these pods in the future to reinstate the room into its original state and allow for future interventions again. Now, that's highly unlikely, but it becomes part of the way we think about that kind of cognizant act of, knowing that I inherited something, but we also know that someone else is going to inherit what we do. And we have to be really mindful now as we work through the projects that we're working on to think about what are the possibilities that this building may have in the future? What are the likely chapters it might have in time? Because for whatever reason, commercial reasons, demand on population, density, etc., many of these projects might, within a certain number of years, be looking at further extensions or further densification. And what we found particularly interesting is that the building fabric here lends itself so easily to that. It has a thickness, like it's fat enough to absorb change in a way a lot of the hyper efficiencies of buildings we build today tend not to. And that was something that was really important. So these slides are just showing some of the other interior spaces where we worked through using really simple materials like MDF, but working through these textured surfaces through a sort of CNC cutting, a digital craft, to replicate references to the Art Deco details within the building. And some of those spaces, which, whilst we were on site, there were some extraordinary discoveries because this particular mezzanine did not appear in any survey. It was completely encased within walls. There was no line-up. It was a room which today, through point cloud surveying, may have appeared, but it was only through the initial enabling works and strip out that we discovered that the space even existed, and then it was transformed so that we could actually experience the vaulted ceiling and all of the plasterwork details. So we were designing really in a strategic way to make sure that every part of the building became an experience from within the hotel. So the hotel components, so whether you're lying in the bed and looking up closer at these details, or whether you're at a sink and you're interfacing it, there was a very almost sort of surgical precision with which we inserted new elements into the building to really bring out its value. A lot of our work also was in introducing other collaborations, so artists who worked on the project with us, integrating their details, their work, and finding collaborations through furniture design as well. So the lights are our design, but we worked with a local artist who works with silicon beading, like silicon embroidery, and we collaborated to create this work where all of the lampshades, the inside of them are embroidered with a silicon, it's a silicon beading detail that they use typically for jewelry, but here we asked them to integrate it into the inside of the lamps. And similarly on walls, we do quite a bit of furniture design ourselves as well, and so all of the work was really conceived through layers and layers of collaboration with different artists or different fabricators to allow us to really explore how we detailed the spaces throughout. And when it came to services, again, this was sort of an inaccessible basement at the time, which was then converted into the pool and spa facilities. And we tried as much as possible to reference and to create new interpretations or dialogue with the sort of historical details, which were often Art Deco details in the ventilation grills, which we then created a new design for and introduced lighting and all of the other services that needed to be integrated into these spaces. And so the facade was a major project because obviously we had introduced a series of different extensions which in of themselves were quite heterogeneous, and we wanted to create an identity for the project which was more unified, and part of that process was figuring out how we create a new facade, but which is has gone through this sort of analysis or these studies of the historical reference points that we discovered within the building. And it was a very detail-oriented work to create the filigree on the cladding And it went through studies of original grille types, which you can see across there, and then their evolution into new systems of patterning that allowed us to mitigate the different conditions that we were also hiding behind the facade. So whether there was an opening, whether there was a window, which needed larger openings, whether we were looking to conceal equipment that needed smaller openings. So there was quite an extensive drawing process where we really looked at how we would integrate movement across the facade that felt almost natural, but had the but would allow us to sort of modify the pattern as we moved through spaces where we were interfacing floor slabs or technical equipment or other things that we did not want to become as visible through it. And the entirety of it was sort of mapped out as an entire fabrication pattern that was then sent off for CNCing. I mean, of course, we didn't do the shop drawings, but we were very, very carefully worked through every single panel, those which are operable, those which are not, etc., through that process of design. And then we can also see it's quite interesting to see historical extensions upon which new extensions were then built, and we worked immensely through one-to-one prototyping, which is something we do across as many of our projects as we can, where we try to establish, what is working, what is not. Again, this depends a little bit on the client and the budget that we're working with, but it enables us to really test live what the experience of space will be. And for the most part, this has actually worked really, really well. It creates a really beautiful space. On the inside, there are rooms that actually have this filigree in front of them. Those windows are completely operable and you can open up that facade. And then in other spaces, it continues without operation for other reasons. And I think this is probably one of my favorite photos of this project, because it really demonstrates that idea of strata that I was speaking about earlier, where we're not looking to put a nice clean bow around the work we're doing. We know that it's going to be open-ended because we know it's likely to go through potential change. That doesn't mean that we're not seeking a completeness. We do want to finish our projects. We want them to have a sense of closure, but we want them to feel like it's more like writing with the knowledge of sequels and knowing that we may be adding to it in time, and at every stage it will feel complete but open to possible multiplicities. And I think probably what's been most successful is the return of life to a building that lay abandoned for over 20 years. It's been amazing to see new events take place, the civic spaces get used again by both the public and for events. It's changed the building entirely. It has it sits in a city fringe neighborhood, which was pretty rough, and it's become a major. It really changed the way that neighborhood works. So there are a number of different events which take place for various community groups, but also the introduction of the hotel component, which made it financially viable to have those spaces, have meant that it's thriving as a building, but also the neighborhood is thriving alongside it. And that reintroduction of life has really been a very rewarding. I suppose many of my friends got married in this building, so it's quite nice to kind of see it come full circle. So another one of our projects, which I'm going to tear through a couple of projects now, I'll pick up speed a little. Another one of our projects that I want to talk about is Castle Lane, which sits in a very contested neighbourhood because it's very, very... It sits in very close proximity to Buckingham Palace and to Victoria Station, and these are really old established neighborhoods where you can almost do nothing ever. It's nearly impossible to build. And the particular site, the project we won through competition because we were the only ones that did not step away from the boundary and work only with the interior. And I think that's a pretty important point, because not only is it counterintuitive to sort of city building in some ways, but it was also to them, to the particular clients that we're working with, they felt that there was a shying away from the immense challenges that, 4 street fronts, a pub that sits right beside the building, and the many residential streets that surround it would have been too much of a battle for other architects, and we were ready to sort of face that challenge head on. So it was designed around the particularities of rights of light, which is quite a specific planning. It's not even, it doesn't even exactly sit in planning. It's a legal right to have light to your facade or to your living space, and that right, it creates a carve out of, it constructs a series of cones and carve outs to any future development that might come in time. And what we were effectively doing was creating a sculpting effectively the carve-outs of those volumes, and then we lent on a typology which was not about an overall architectural shape, but for a typology that would effectively work to create the individual apartment scale interface, and was flexible enough to deal with the push and pull of the many challenges that we knew that we were going to face. So, every bend and curve and carve out is actually a reflection of a negotiation, like a paper negotiation with a neighbor that took place, where we legally agreed that they could have that much light, and we needed to scoop out some of our building to enable that. So we were not looking to design a shape, we were effectively looking to design a tool for negotiation, and it served us very well. So this geometry which emerged from that, every time that we were moving for a concave curve or an outward curve was in response to some sort of condition where we were taking something away from one corner only to give it back elsewhere. And that results in gloriously ugly plans, which we're extremely proud of. But it has also allowed us to create urban fabric, which has been really successful, and it also dialogues really well with the historical urban fabric on all of those streets. So as you can see, we used the traditional English bay window as a tool for us to then explore how that typology would evolve in a contemporary way. We did a series of studies across the streetscape to look at the types of windows that we were working with, and you get this ruffle, I guess, of facades which line these streets, and you can really see the sort of distinct movement, and that movement is quite powerful. So we really wanted to create something that would dialogue with that, and our geometry went through a number of different studies where we were effectively looking at which corners we could manipulate and which ones we wouldn't be able to. But we studied through spatial alignment, what happens to glass when you curve it. You get a refraction, you get sort of areas where the image is completely distorted and where you can see clearly through. So there was a series of studies done to figure out what would be the right shape or geometry that we would begin to work with, and then effectively a series of studies with Arab Facades Group on how we would manipulate the glass to ensure that people would not be sick standing in front of their windows, or They would not set cars on fire because of the heat refraction of the glass. That happened in London some years ago. So we have, there were also a series of thermal studies on how heat would react on the surface and you know, effectively testing and finding the right geometry that would sit perfectly within that. And then, of course, the built result. So there are a series of townhouses which effectively sit within the streetscape that has townhouses. There is the larger part of the building, and usually when you know, as I mentioned earlier, when you do a push and pull in one direction, you often have to carve out in another to compensate. So that this project is more a sort of contractual negotiation than a pure architectural conception in a way. So some of the things that we often do as a part of our projects is we begin research projects on things that we really want to have, but sometimes clients don't pick them up, and we find ourselves recycling ideas in other projects when we can. So in this particular project, for reasons of asbestos and major structural damage, there was a smaller building which was demolished, but we wanted to reuse all of the demolition material. So the contractor, who was Mace, actually prepared a series of samples for us, which were we played around with the possibilities to use sort of a percentage of roof tile, a percentage of brick, a percentage of cement mixtures to create a series of terrazzos. This client didn't bite. We ended up just using bricks. That was what fit within their budget. But obviously it kind of spurred a series of research projects that we then carried out on other projects. And that's that one. So I want to now talk about this idea of urban bas relief, which is something we often see in cities. It's an exploration of thickness. So the bas relief is typically a sculpture that has been sculpted into stone, but sits in a shallow depth, so it's like a panel, and that's an example of it. And you get that depth of shadow and movement, which is a really interesting exploration of thickness and something that we find particularly interesting. So for this particular project, again, sort of in a European context, this idea felt like an interesting way for us to explore how we may consider that sort of stepped movement of facade. And in this particular case, this one's been designed with stone because they could afford it. But there's a series of movements that we really wanted to explore across how these typologies work, but also to sort of think through a modularity of units of which we only had 3, and they were switched and alternated to create a differentiation, which we always seek to do in the work we do. And what was particularly interesting with this particular site is that often when you're creating housing or apartments, there are limitations. People feel that they want a garden, and they feel they're losing a garden, and they're losing the possibility of having skylights or sky rooms. And so we actually looked for ways in which to reintroduce those concepts by creating that stepped floor plate and creating the sense of movement throughout the building. Again, a very tight site. We only ever get tight sites. A number of interfaces with other smaller buildings, many of them listed, and often sort of back-facing onto other parts of city blocks. So this particular site only had access from one street. And we were effectively having to introduce a higher density into it. So it was about navigating those different proportions that surrounded us, but also being able to fill and create a sense of open space for as many apartments as we could through roof terracing and terracing in general, but also the introduction of that idea that I was talking about earlier, which are the sky rooms. And that bas relief actually, as a concept, emerged through both plan, typology, and detail, and we carried that idea of being able to create sky rooms through that stepping into interior details as well, that allow us to really feel like you're getting the half of the experience of having a house that you don't typically get in the conditions when you have apartments. And I wanted to sort of introduce a couple of projects that continue to explore that thickness at every budget and every scale, because we often find that there's a flatness that is emerging due to developer pressure, commercial pressures, etc. And the power of space that has been calibrated to exist outside of the larger part of a room. So the corners where, you can hide, the corners where you can be in the middle of writing something or reading something that you leave open and undisturbed, are increasingly disappearing from our architectural plans, and that's something that we really find particularly interesting in kind of economizing or sort of feeling this pressure to create open plans. There's a loss of that notch that actually provides potential for different kinds of activity that happens at the scale of one person or two people. And those are actually pretty important spaces, which we really try to introduce when we can into our projects. Again, other tight sites. This particular project explores that notch or that thickness where it's quite a small site. So in order to introduce light into this building, we looked for a detail that would allow us to not have the primary living spaces be flat on to the street facade, so you're not seeing inside the space entirely. I mean, of course, you'll see somewhat inside the space, but having created that depth or that bay within the facade creates a distance that allows for a sense of privacy, but also an opportunity for other types of uses within that particular notch. And the reason why I like to talk about this project, which at a glance is pretty straightforward, looks pretty simple, doesn't seem to come with too many challenges, is because this was a car park of the warehouse building beside. And this, I don't know if you can see my cursor if I point to it this way. Can you? Yeah? So this particular facade should have been blind if we were to follow the rules correctly. And we did this completely legally, but through negotiation. And that is something that you can do in the UK. There are many countries in which you can't. But effectively, we negotiated because of this garden and the fact that housing as a category trumps all other categories of requirements. London is really struggling with having sufficient housing. We effectively said, look, because this is an important use category, because of this particular garden, we were effectively using it as an excuse to say that we would render this garden should be preserved. So we got the right for this garden to be protected so that we could then put windows here, and then effectively this site will never be able to develop in front of us for the distance that tree stands. And that process, because this was owned by a completely other, a different owner, it's a private university or private college, they put up a little bit of a fight. They were like, well, we don't want you to impact our right for development. And it's like, are you going to develop anytime soon? No, we're not. We've just completed a building. And then it became an entire negotiation instigated by us. So it felt like a David and Goliath story, but instigated by us, and which we eventually won the right to do. So it enabled us to create something that is completely different, because we effectively aren't dealing with a blind facade condition. We had to mitigate some of the challenges around fire safety, etc., for building windows to a boundary, but all of those were met, and it completely changed what the building had the potential to be and could be as a result. So, we were able to really benefit from all common areas and the private areas to actually really have these external views out on all sides, and to benefit from light, and for us to program spaces in a completely different way as a result. And there's some pictures of the details. And what was particularly interesting about this site is that we used the research from the project I showed earlier, where we had been working with composites from building waste, And on this particular site, we were able to actually use that research and apply it through creating cement, paper, and resin composites from some of the construction waste to create these panels that clad the facade with this effect of crumpled paper. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this happens across many of our projects where we find ourselves dealing with really gritty urban environments where we are navigating the various challenges of what each site brings. And in this particular case, on this particular site, we were looking at a number of different alignments that came. This was like, there are charities that are selling their assets because they can no longer maintain them, but actually, again, through public-private partnership, arrange a scenario where they have access to a portion of the building as a permanent lease in a way. And so this particular site in Dalston was where we were, again, reintroducing housing as a program. Part of that program's negotiation was to maintain a youth centre or a public space for which existed prior. And here, again, working with these challenges around budgets and finding ways to create a certain richness and depth in space, we wanted to use the alignments to create these quite deep lodges. Now, these are the happy or dangerous accidents, whichever you'd like to call them. We designed lodges with a series of stepped roofs, but the roofs were strictly not to be used. Of course, when we went back to photograph, the person who was living in this apartment had decided to colonize the entire roof there and created a major fire risk and safety risk for us. These things happen. We have to go back. We have to erect balustrades now as a part of making sure that people, if they want to use it, they're going to be protected in that case. But these are, I mean, we try, and then people do what they want, which is in many ways exciting and interesting. We actually were quite amused by it, but it comes with a number of challenges when we have to actually deal with litigation because of it. And what's quite interesting with this building is that a program slips underneath it, and the youth space sits on the ground and basement floors, and those alignments have allowed us to sort of line up against different housing typologies that surround it and the pub next door. And this is at an affordable, this is like affordable housing that's Peabody, so it's like how do I explain Peabody? It's like workers' housing that was arranged mostly for the police force originally, and now is accessible to a wider body of people. So we often think about heterogeneity in housing because it's so much of the work we do. And we think about it because there's this sort of, often when you do social housing, pure social housing, there's this sense to say everybody gets the same window, everybody gets the same balcony, everybody gets the same amount of space, so it's all equal. But that has led to a sort of ghettoization and a stigma that quickly emerges around social housing. And for this particular site in Deauville in France, which is a really interesting city that has all this. It was a 19th century playground for wealthy families who created this balnearic style of architecture. We were asked to look at a social housing scheme for that would be 50% social housing and 50% for sale. And we realized that in giving everybody the same size window and giving everybody the same size balcony, you sort of take away the sense of identity around I live here, like that's my window, and that heterogeneity actually begins to matter quite a bit. And rather than separating blocks and having the social be one block and the for sale housing be another, what we've learnt through having lived in cities for so many years, but also through the way they're built, that when you create a sense of mixity within the one building, you actually improve acceptance, you improve integration, and spaces get used in a much, like the communities become much more integrated and much more tied together. And so we wanted to explore that idea of heterogeneity, where we're introducing through, again, a very tricky site where there were a series of different neighbouring buildings that had different heights and different challenges, to explore a typology where we were effectively looking at referencing that Balnearic historical typology, but introducing it in a completely contemporary way, using materials that made more sense for the time here. And in Deauville, we can actually really build with timber, because mass timber is increasingly a construction material that is easy to build with. It's fast and is very accessible, but also creating a sense of dialogue with the heterogeneity of the city fabric that we were surrounded by, and giving people that sense of, like, I live here, like that is my treehouse, that particular one is mine, and being able to identify that as a part of the design. And that's where this particular scheme emerged from, and allowed us to sort of explore how we really think through typology and its variation. The plan itself sort of emerges as a series of tubes, so all of the apartments are built on this tube typology that are on a grid that works structurally for the mass timber, but it allows for spaces that are that have multiple, every single apartment has multiple orientations, often opens up to terraces, whether they're north-south or or both in many cases, and there's a sense of depth that is used to integrate many of the programs and consolidate the experience of openness between those spaces. And in this particular case, we are working on a charter coir, which is a marine grade resistance timber, and it's pre-charred and then tinted to allow it to resist and sort of ages really well. And for that particular city and in this particular weather, that is a very suitable choice, because it's suitable for marine environments. So I want to touch quickly on this idea of urban surgery and the way in which we often find ourselves not having. So far, many of the projects I've shown you have a sense of kind of complete identity, but sometimes what we're doing is so surgical and so specific to very particular moments within a larger site that actually it's very difficult to identify what the building is when you add it all up. And this, for us, is an almost urban interior kind of project, because it's 3 different buildings. This is the Fulham Town Hall, which is 3 different buildings that sit across different streets, and the knuckles are actually other buildings where we are inserting 4 different programs, so commercial workspace, a hotel, past housing, and a series of public exhibition spaces as a part of the civic component for the city. And it's an extremely challenging site because we have, because a large part of the building is only accessed through a back lane and makes it very complex to navigate. So we only have so much facade that we can access, and therefore a lot of what our introduction, the way that we are able to introduce is through roof escapes and through roof interventions. And to enable that, that sort of introduction of these multiple programs through a building that is so extraordinary, it also very, very eclectic. It has many histories, also in a state of very challenging degradation. It's very costly to work in buildings like this, so it only makes sense when you can have many, like when you're, as I mentioned earlier, the business plan is completely bulletproof, because the city themselves will get nervous that the projects get stopped or abandoned halfway. And so what we had to do was really think through design as a kind of staged intervention, but also enabling public routes, almost like interior streets, to run through this building whilst programs were either getting built and getting renovated to allow some public functioning or meanwhile programming to work within it. It's been quite an extensive exercise, as you can see, because we're going to struggle with daylight for any kind of new intervention. A lot of this is happening as a series of surgical introductions that are taking place in different parts of that building format, and then the introduction of new circulations and new cores that allow for any one program to operate independently. It's a very complex site, so I'm not going to run you through plans. I think everybody will fall asleep. But I wanted to sort of introduce this idea that sometimes what we do, we don't leave with an image of our intervention in its entirety. And what ends up happening are very moment-based interventions where we're introducing a new circulation space, a new series of lifts or circulation staircases. We're introducing a new extension within a courtyard that can only be experienced or seen from by certain programs for the way they will access it. But also sometimes we're actually navigating roofscapes where it actually creates these opportunities to do some pretty crazy detailing, which I think if we didn't have the experience we've had from domestic work or sort of doing smaller houses, we wouldn't be able to appreciate the scale of intervention that this necessitates and how much variety there is in that, and how many ways we were able to sort of reconcile creating a detail that belonged in one spot that could be iterated and modified to work in other areas without completely compromising the sense of a whole within this building. And so that particular project instigated a sort of a research agenda, which, you know, sometimes urban surgery for the purposes of economics also turns into versions of climate surgery. And we're currently working for the city of Paris on a particular building, which is a factory. It's a light industrial building where they make ceramics within the city. And the building is from the 80s, so this is sort of in that, staying within the vein of what we inherit and whether we love it all and whether we want it all. This particular building, there are elements of it which are really interesting and incredible, and there are also many elements which are just unfortunate, and it was very poorly built, and it doesn't have the fat on it that a lot of the projects that we're used to working with do from the 19th century, that kind of over-engineered mass that allows you to figure out how to run services through. You can build layers onto it, knowing those layers can then be pulled back. These buildings tend to be engineered to within sort of an inch of their lives, and there's no real potential for us to come in and say, okay, we'll run some services through that slab and everything will work. It won't. They'll mostly fall. So we're actually having to rethink the way we have been working with urban strata up to now, and think about how we engineer differently. So the challenge with this existing factory is that they wanted to keep, I mean, they're not keeping it running while we work on it, but it's overheating. Paris is overheating generally, but these buildings often that were built in the 60s, 70s and 80s are really overheating because they don't have any thermal mass and they don't benefit from any insulation, which largely happened afterwards. So part of our studies were how to think about shading. Really simple things that we wanted to introduce was, you know, not tech-based solutions. We really try to avoid air conditioning as much as we can. We don't design, everything has air conditioning, but we design for people not to be reliant on it for thermal comfort. So a lot of our work was about considering how we shade the building, how we introduce planting, because planting is the single most successful way to deal with urban heat islands right now. Thinking through how we create surfaces that reflect the light and refract it in another direction, and also thinking through ventilation, and then a respiratory system for the facade. So obviously openings, but also insulating to allow for a better thermal performance throughout. And that process then went on for us to detail new cladding systems that use terracotta. It's sort of an extruded terracotta system that maintains all the columns, uses the structure that we have, and effectively layers a new facade into it, and then introduces within it an operable facade where you can actually tend to the plants that we're introducing into the building, because often planted facades tend to just be a maintenance nightmare for most clients. So here we wanted something that they could actually work with, and that is an in-progress project that you can see the render of there. But this work has led us to work with the city on a broader climate surgery, I suppose we could call it, which is effectively looking at the we won a grant a few years ago to begin a research project for the City of Paris on how we could help them transition out of basically away from a gas dependency. So the entire city's infrastructure sits on gas dependency. That's the main pipelines. Of course, there's electricity and other things, but every household generally runs on gas. And the entire roofscapes of Paris are a UNESCO listed site, so nothing can be interfered with. But the upgrading of any of these buildings to have new energy infrastructure comes with major challenges. So every time we face new heat waves and major challenges in the way people are choosing to sort of, people are suffering, and so they're buying air conditioning effectively. Every time that happens, it presents this potential risk that both the facades and the roofscapes will become littered with air conditioning condenser units to the outside, or the possibility that these challenges around gas dependency will lead to air source heat pumps, which are the obvious solution. But if everybody introduces them on their own, we will end up with a landscape of air source heat pumps and air conditioning condenser units. And so we began this research project with them through their building stock that they wholly owned. So the city owns a number of social housing buildings, which basically became our test bed to run through and study the various unit typologies. So obviously these buildings were originally designed to often be one flat per floor. They've gone through major transition where, you know, they've been cut up and subdivided and subdivided and subdivided, and now, you know, there are often many more habitants living within these buildings than they were originally designed for, and therefore the energy demand on the buildings can be quite variable. And so we went through doing a study of how we might consider different scenarios of subdivision and what that has resulted in terms of demand on external units, and if everybody was to buy their own, what that would look like on a building. And then effectively looking at ways in which we could use this study to inform body corporates or sort of building management companies on how they can actually create a plan to have a series of buildings transition into new tech like air source heat pumps, etc., but on a consolidated level, so that everybody is using a sort of shared power source, which is pretty unusual. I know there are many other cities that run on shared power. For Paris, this is a pretty significant step because it's not something they've never designed for, but it will, you know, at the moment we're still in the middle of the study and looking at how these roofscapes might then get adapted to allow the chimney stacks to then, those which are in use, those which aren't in use, to get converted into new stacks that are effectively being used for external units, for air source heat pumps and other things. So that is an in-progress study, but another example of what it means to sort of do a sort of urban surgery at a scale of a city, or come up with a strategy at the scale of a city. And I think this is sort of closes up the talk that I wanted to give around this idea of strata, and not only thinking about the work we do through the processes, but also sort of keeping in mind all the time that we are challenging the cities in which we live to become denser, to serve us more, to serve us faster, for us to be able to move through them faster, for us to maintain a sense of thermal comfort, for there to be a sense of kind of equality between those who have and those who have less. And I think if we always think about those things as individual problems to solve, we rarely solve them properly. So it's about being able to kind of unify those questions and thinking through the consequences or implications of any one problem on another, and not really shying away from the dirty word, which is economics and money and the fact that things cost money to build. So they become an inherent factor in how we think about the shape of our cities and the pressure we put on them, and how we design with people by raising awareness, by involving them and having them understand what we do and why we do it. And sort of introducing them to the process of architecture so that it becomes something that they actually value in a way which may not be the case here, but for many Western cities, we're increasingly feeling that developers are eclipsing our relevance, and so we try to sort of make sure that we remain publicly active through conversations, through co-authorship and collaboration, to make sure that the space we occupy and the reasons we do the work we do is really visible to at least at a kind of government level or at a scale at which people can get involved in it. And these are just sort of some closing slides, so I'll leave it there, maybe. Actually, sorry, it's really important. Obviously, we're here in Bangalore because of MIST, the museum, and it is with great appreciation, and it's a great privilege and a responsibility to be able to work on such an important site for your city, and that means so much. And I think we're coming at this with an immense sense of respect for the place, and knowing that we're inheriting something that has had a huge amount of value to yourselves, and we really hope that what we're bringing as a team to this project is something that everybody will be able to share and benefit from and enjoy in the future. And I'd just like to close to introduce the other half and the creative genius behind all the work. So Michelle is not here, but he is the other half of Drew, and is very much all the energy and the creativity behind the practice. Thank you.
Lux is our sponsor. You know, they sponsored all our events, and they were very clear that they'll only sponsor the talks and not dinner. So you're on your own. Next, we have Roisin Hennigan. She's an architect and co-founder with Shifu Peng and Hennigan Peng Architects, based in Dublin and Berlin. She studied at University College Dublin and Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Significant projects include the Grand Egyptian Museum, Palestinian Museum, and Giant's Causeway Visitor Center. H. Park, as they're called, have been awarded the Aga Khan Award in Architecture for the Palestinian Museum and twice shortlisted for the Reba Sterling Prize, among significant recognition. In 2026, they were included in the Time magazine's 100 Most Influential Companies. Roisin actively participates in architectural dialogue through teaching, talks, exhibition, and competition jury work. Roisin.
Thank you, Smaran. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Amrita, for a wonderful talk. And so, thank you. We are delighted to be here in Bangalore. It has been a very intense competition. Delighted to have the opportunity to work on MIST, learning lots about Bangalore and eating lots of food as well, but lots more to eat, I think. I'm going to maybe get straight into it. So what I'd like to talk about is museum and place. And in a way, I think museums are a place today where we tell a story about ourselves. It's not just about a collection of work. It's the stories that we tell through the way that we display it. And I think, how we tap into the place is quite important. At least we think it's very important. So I'm going to talk about two projects. One is the Palestinian Museum. It's kind of interesting because it's a museum that didn't have a collection. So it came about because what was known as Welfare then decided that it was important to have a place where there could be a discussion of what it meant to be a Palestinian. It was kind of a cultural space. But the museum is a way to, in a way, generate a collection. So it's a temporary exhibition space, or a host for events. And the site, it's in the West Bank. And the West Bank, of course, extends from the Jordan Valley to the Mediterranean. And our site was on this terraced Mediterranean landscape, which was created to create these agricultural terraces. They create flat spaces for farming, so it also collects water, but it's a very distinctive landscape. And this is a quote, I think so many architects probably use it, but still it's a great quote from Italo Calvino. "The city doesn't tell its past, but contains it like the lines of a hand, written in the corners of the streets, the gratings of the window, the banisters of the steps, antennae, so on and so forth." So that within every mark of a city is contained its history. And I think that's something that we found really interesting. So within this site, within these walls, that there were broken down terrace walls along the site that held within it a story of this place. Because I think one of the things that was, for us, was going to be a challenge was how do we deal with Palestinian identity? You know, it's so easy to maybe freeze something at a moment in time, but then how do you leave space for other generations to create that identity? And one of the things visiting the site, this is also a competition, I noticed that within the walls there were all these little plants growing, because of course the walls capture the water, and that kind of had this little this other world, if you like. From the top of the site, so we were on a hillside, there is a view to the Mediterranean. It was facing west, and that actually became very important to us because, of course, for so many Palestinians, they can never get to the Mediterranean because, of course, they can't cross into Israel proper. This was a photo taken by Iwan Ban when the museum opened, and the museum had put an installation into the gallery where they put sand on the floor and ran a projection of the sea. And the kids, of course, because kids are kids, they were playing in the sand, but of course they can never get to the Mediterranean from where they live. So this is a site. To the right-hand side of the image is the top of the hill, so it's sloping down, and the top of the right-hand side is east, so it's sloping down to the west. So of course, the natural thing is we had to master plan the site, was to create a grid, but of course that doesn't work. But we did need to structure the site in some way, so we decided to use the contours of the site, but then to introduce control points, introduce them along the contour lines, because we did want to work with these contour lines that had those agricultural terraces. And then we build at the top, because it was important that this museum have a strong identity from day one. It, if you like, crowns the hill, and then it takes advantage of these views to the west, looking across to the Mediterranean. And this here is a section through the site, so the building creates this very distinctive top to the hill, and then the gardens terrace down. So the building has quite a simple organization. It is essentially a large temporary exhibition gallery, and there's also quite a large administration, because a lot of Palestinians can't actually get into the West Bank, so the museum organize exhibition in other places where there are large Palestinian populations. They also have an online collection. They collect oral histories. So there's a central entrance here. Well, you can see it. It's that open space. I don't know if we have a pointer. With the temporary exhibition gallery to the bottom, and then the administration to the top. But coming to the landscape, so as I mentioned, the issue of Palestinian identity for us, or well, how we kind of tap into that, was something that was a concern. So when this was a photo taken on that first visit to the site, and it was a cold November day. This is a photo of wild thyme, which was growing on the site. And this was, so the museum is actually in a university, so we were walking around the site. There was a guy from the facilities management at the university and two architects that we were working with. And you can see he's holding some thyme in his hand, because Samia saw the wild thyme. And they suddenly started talking about all these dishes. So there's za'atar that is used in a lot of Palestinian cooking. And they started having this really animated discussion. I realized that actually, through what grows there, there's a way into, if you like, the cultural practice and a whole kind of heritage. And that maybe it was through the landscape that we could find a way into this issue of a Palestinian identity, while still leaving it open, if you like, for those future generations. So we did construct a new contour, because of course ours was a very, I suppose, constructed landscape, as opposed to, we say, those agricultural terraces that more were created by farmers. So we started at the east end of the site with what we call the cultural landscape. So thinking about the West Bank, through this region has come a lot of that routing from Asia into Europe. So the Silk Road came through there. So what grows now in the West Bank are both plants that came on that route from Asia that are now very associated with the region, but weren't actually native to the region. So if you think of citrus, that came from China, I believe. So at the east end of the site, closest to the building, there's that cultural landscape where there are the plants that are the garden landscape, and as you move down to the west, it becomes into that more natural landscape. So closest to the building, the home orchard, so pomegranate, fig, and so on, and mulberry. And then we also thought that the cafe then could have the dishes that are made from those foods, because at every point, food was a really strong focus for people. It really brought people together. Moving down a bit farther, the olive, the carob, and then what comes from that, the oil, olive oil, soap, almonds. Farther down again, the medicinal orchard, from chamomile tea, then moving a bit more into the indigenous forestry, into the picnic grasses, because this is something that happens in the region. Because there isn't so much rainfall, so that first rainfall in spring, the grasses bloom and people all go to picnic outside. So again, it's a cultural practice that happens. And then finally out to the scrubland where there's the oregano and then what grows in that kind of rock landscape. But of course, we being kind of these, we're a bit obsessed with grids. We do order things, but as well, because this is a constructed landscape, we did construct those terraces. So this is a photo where you can see those very straight lines that kind of pick up on those contour lines as the site was being constructed. And these are some of the, like, we did not think of this as a museum and a garden. We thought of it, the entire museum, as being the entire site, both garden and building. Ah, pointer. Thank you. Okay. How do I do this? Oh, well, yeah. So this is the construction site plan. Okay. Oh, you can see that. So there, yeah, you can see that was a rock outcrop that we discovered that wasn't in our original survey. So that became quite a part of the landscape. This is the site. So you can see here the museum, and you can see how it's kind of picking up that contoured landscape. From above, actually, it looks very, very dry. When you're in it, it's much lusher. So, as I said, we saw everything as being one project, not museum and landscape. And we worked with Lara Zurakat in Amman, who we worked very closely with her on the landscape design. And when we came to the building, we saw it, if you like, as a culmination of the landscape, but we also did want it to create this kind of crown to the hill. So it has this sculpted form. And because this is a stone area, we wanted to use stone. So as you can see, the building is this kind of monolithic structure where the stone actually continues onto the roof of the building. So we were quite rigorous about how we set it out. So maybe I'll just flip back here. You can see the way that the points of the building comes to these points. So we wanted that to occur both inside the building and outside the building. So we did set some problems up for ourselves. So the outside has one setting out, and the inside, because it's an exposed concrete slab inside, has a slightly offset setting out. So you can see here the red line is the outside geometry, but because, of course, we have quite a lot of thickness, because in the West Bank, it gets reasonably cold because we're high up in the hills in winter, and then in summer it gets quite warm. Energy is a real issue in this area, so we had to have a very efficient building, so we did need a heavily insulated building. So you can see that the inside has a slightly offset geometry, so at each point where we have clean geometries inside and out. Because as well we have a concrete slab, but we have quite a large span. We didn't want any columns in the temporary exhibition space, so we had to have a beam. So the question was, where should the beam go? If it went inside, it was going to interrupt our nice clean soffit. So we decided to put it above to create upstand beams, and then we did set up some more problems for ourselves, which I'll explain. So that's the geometry of the building for the concrete to be set out. And these are some of the setting out drawings that we developed. You can see some of those upstand beams in that upper left image. So I'll go in a bit more detail as well on the stone and why it was an issue. However, we do come from in Ireland, the UK, and in Germany, where we do a lot of our work, we tend to set out concrete using special plywood panels, so they're fairly easy to control. But in the West Bank, the formwork is actually done with these just slats of wood. So I think it's kind of similar to how it's done here. So it's a different system of setting up concrete, and then there was this kind of very fine scaffolding, if you like, inside. So we had quite rigorous, if you like, geometries to achieve with maybe a concrete tradition that wasn't really as accustomed to these fine geometries. But we worked very, very closely with the contractor, Ferris to Bailey, and we achieved a lot of it. So now we did end up plastering the concrete, so we still were able to use the mass of the concrete. So we decided ultimately to plaster it. But one of the things that was also nice about working on the project was because it was so important to people in the West Bank. This is the crane operator. So he actually took photos and would post them on his feed. So these are the upstand beams that was allowing us within the gallery space to have those clear spans. So then the second thing that we had to deal with, if you like, was the stone. It is a stone area, and we were going to use limestone. So, but the way it's typically used is kind of just stacked up against the concrete wall of the building. However, we absolutely had to insulate it. The museum wanted to achieve a very high standard, a museum-grade space in Ashray A. They had to minimize the energy coming into it, and because of the external conditions, we had to insulate it. So therefore, the stone had to be offset. We needed to insulate between the concrete and the stone, because inside the building, we also needed to use the thermal mass to help us to control the internal temperature. So this is what we wanted to achieve in terms of the stones, have all of these geometries coming together. So you can see there the stone is set out parallel to our end grids. But of course, because these are all sloping surfaces, none of the stone is at 90-degree angles. So what's typical was at the top. This is typically how it would be built in the West Bank, but we wouldn't really be able to do that where the stone came on top of the insulation and then directly onto the slab. We weren't able to do that. So the stone is set on a metal grid, which then is on top of the waterproofing, on top of the insulation, on the concrete. So what that meant was all of the set out for all of that steel needed to be resolved beforehand, before the stone was cut, before it could be brought on site, which was actually, it was an incredibly demanding ask, and it wasn't something that the industry in the area was that familiar with, because it wasn't typically done that way. But our contractor completely, he set up a team, a Revit team, to resolve the geometries, so that then his team worked out the stone geometries. Like, we gave them files, they worked out the stone and steel geometries to set them off to be cut. So this is the sketch. This is Ferras's to Bailey's drawings. This is the shop drawings that we received, so you can see how they're achieving all of those alignments, coming in a bit closer, how the that green, that's the gutter, which is in behind. And this is then the installation on site. Some more images there of it. Yeah, it was a funny coming together of this incredibly precise stone cutting with then this kind of much more handcrafted approach. So there's the plan of the, oh yeah, sorry. So this is west here. So the plan of the building is set up where we have these windows to the west, but we also had to achieve quite good environmental control and not have too much heat built up with that low west-facing sun. So what we ended up doing was we isolated the galleries. So here is the temporary exhibition gallery, and then there's a buffer space in front of it, which creates a buffer zone for the gallery. It ended up, we called it the glass gallery, so we're not having as tight control in that space, but it allows us to mediate between the external and the very close control required in the gallery. So that's the diagram of the space, and this is how it ended up in built. What's really interesting is that space has actually become an incredibly used space. It's used for events, it's used for exhibitions. They just don't put their really sensitive artwork there. This is, you know, orientation space, because of course the view across the gardens is amazing. There's an auditorium in front of it. For the opening, which was a real surprise to me, they invited a dance group in and they created a performance. They were in that space and we were all sitting outside. So this is that group rehearsing. You can see there the shadows of the glazing on it. In order to create shading, we have a series of fins because the windows are triangular. The fins are lowest at the bottom and then they get deeper as they go higher. So you can see there it's much deeper, and then as it comes to the lower area where you don't need as much shading, it is, you know, it comes closer to the surface, so it gives you some depth. That's what Amrita was talking about, trying to create subtly maybe a sense of depth. So the landscape, this is the landscape as it was when we were in construction. The interesting thing was, while the building has a lot of these kind of, we needed to achieve these very close controls, there was this kind of precision around the facade, the landscape, a completely different approach was taken. In actual fact, we couldn't get machinery in because of the terraces, so all of the tilling all had to be done with animals. Another interesting thing was, because for many people in the West Bank, the whole idea of fences is you know, there are barriers everywhere, and the museum absolutely insisted there wasn't going to be a fence around this. So what you're seeing there is a culvert, and that's actually the edge of the site. So this is then the landscape as it started to be developed. And a really lovely thing about the whole project is, because in a way the gardens were something that just emerged, that they started to, the museum started to develop it almost as a botanical garden for the West Bank, and they have this entire information booklet. They also have exhibitions outside. So it's organized to have both, a fast path, and then there's a slower zigzag path, which is also accessible. So it allows kind of families to go out and, take a very slow route through the site. So some views through it, and this is as that accessible path kind of carves its way through the site. And then this is actually, this photo here is taken looking to the west. That's that amphitheater to the front. That was actually taking advantage of a natural hollow in the site. So we just reversed the topography to create this amphitheater. It is on the site of the university, so a lot of the students come onto the site and they share resources. So the other project I want to talk about is the Egyptian Museum. It's a very large museum. It's very, very close to the pyramids. It was a competition, a very large open competition, which we did many, many years ago. This was actually the competition brief. It was very thick. It was in the days when everything was paper-based. So I suppose we started with Egypt. So the museum is to house the pharaonic collection that is currently in Cairo. That was held in the old Egyptian museum, but also they had a huge store of, stores of antiquities all around the city, and they wanted to bring it into one place. So if you think about Egypt, Egypt really was created by the Nile as it carved through the desert. And of course, the Nile flooded. It created this alluvial plain, which was incredibly rich farmland, and then it opened out in the delta out to the Mediterranean. But Egypt is it's said it's the gift of the Nile, but Egypt is about the Nile Valley. And that condition is sectionally inscribed. So as the Nile carved through the desert is like quite a bit higher, the valley is quite a bit lower. And that condition where the valley and desert meet actually occurred right across our site. So we're very close to the pyramids, but the pyramids are at the desert level. I've always thought it's because that was death, and the Nile Valley is the space of life. So this is that. I mean, this isn't our site, but this is where the Nile comes closer to the desert, because, of course, now it's changed from when the pyramids were created. But you do have that huge difference in level. So we had a 30 or 40 meter difference in level across the site. And this is a photo from the site before this was taken in 2003. The photo was taken, we were up on the plateau, and we were looking across towards Cairo, looking to the east, towards Cairo. But you can see the green, and it's incredibly visible. Another photo, so we're looking here to the south, to the pyramids. And so what this image is showing is that carving, this plateau edge. And the decision for us was, because that plateau occurred almost like more or less meandered across the middle of the site. Where were we going to situate the museum? Would we put it above the plateau, or would we put it at the Nile Valley? Because, and so we decided that we couldn't put anything above the plateau edge, because what we did not want to interrupt was that silhouette of the pyramids. The pyramids have been there for 4,000 years, and even though this is a very important museum, we felt that we had to maintain that silhouette where you have the desert and then the silhouette of the pyramids above. So that this museum was going to have its expression, if you like, in the horizontal. But what we decided to do was that the museum was going to create a new plateau edge. So we took a line from the pyramids back to the site, and then, if you like, unfolded that line to take in the view to the pyramids. So from here, and then this actually is a study model. Smaran, we've been talking a lot about models. We were working on MIST. So that little model on the right was a 1 meter by 1 meter model, and that was to be our competition model. And Shifu, my partner, who has is quite obsessive about models. He was like, we were about to set the model off to the model maker, and he was like, no, we can't do this. I was like, well, he said, the pyramids aren't there. And I was like, yeah, but we have to ship this to Cairo. It's a meter by a meter, you know. And so this was, he put out a piece of paper, brought it down to the street because it was January in Dublin. There wasn't enough strong sunlight in the office. And he was like, no, we need to have the pyramids. The model needs to be 3 meters long. So this was the competition model. But you can see, like, it makes sense. It only makes sense if you see it in relationship to the pyramids. So actually, this overlay on this model is showing the geological conditions. This is kind of interesting. It was our geologist who did this. So the green is the alluvial soil of the Nile. The blue is a plateau. And so you can literally see how the soil changes. So this is what we did. We took that line from Khufu's pyramids back to the site, and then we unfolded that line because we thought if you have a museum of pharaonic pieces so close to the pyramids, you have to see it in the same space as the pyramids. However, this difference in level is about 45 meters. So, and I'll return to that point. And then the other thing was that the building gradually tilts up to the pyramids. So it's quite low in profile. It's still quite high, I mean, the building itself. But when you see it from afar, it's fairly low, and it allows the silhouette of the pyramids to hold. This is our team. There was 4 of us in the office when we won this competition. This is the day we won it. So after we won, it was an open competition. We expanded our team, and we were very fortunate to be taken around the British Museum by an Egyptologist. And he picked out what he thought was one of the most significant pieces in the collection, and was this measuring rod, because he said that to understand how Egypt was able to create this civilization, which went on for like 4,000 years. 4,000, I think I'm right, yeah. You had to, this is a measuring rod. They were able to establish this system of measurement across all of these different liquids, weights, so that allowed them to put in place a bureaucracy, a taxation structure. And I think we kind of took this on, so we were kind of interested in this principle of measurement. It was also kind of a very, you know, it's such a simple thing that you might pass by, because sometimes you see all the gold and, if you like, the end result, but sometimes it's the systemic thing that actually underlies everything. So this is coming back to the Nile. So the Nile, of course, was this highway, if you like, that the Egyptians used. And in our competition brief, we have what was called the Nile Park. So we took it as this element that would structure the site as well. So in one direction, we have this kind of visual access to the pyramids, and in the other direction, to create this, the gardens of the site, because it was a 50-hectare site, we unfolded this park that kind of crossed over that very, very strong visual access. So it kind of also created another way of experiencing the site, because if you like, the underlying geometry of that access to the pyramids was so strong, but we also wanted to have another way of experiencing such a huge site. And that also structured the outdoor landscape. So most of the gardens are on the lower part, which is here, but then there was designed one displaced landscape, which was up into that plateau. Unfortunately, that was never built, but that was intended to be, again, a constructed lands of Egypt, because one of the things we wanted to get across was that people would actually understand how the geography of Egypt contributed to the wealth of Egypt, because so much focus is on everything that comes out of the tombs, but to try to understand why did the civilization emerge. So you can see there the way that it structures the site, but you can also see how that level difference occurs at the edge of the building. So this was we worked with a mathematician, structural engineer, on the project. And one of the things, on one of the flights from Cairo back to London, he was doing some maths, and he realized that he could set out the geometry of the building using a mathematical formula. And I'm not going to be able to explain it all. It's actually not so simple, but what we realized was, I should also say, the pyramids are on north, south, east, west. They're on the cardinal axis. So the way we organized the building was that you've got these lines of geometry are those lines that lead to the pyramids, but then this other east-west geometry, we called it the chronological, but we used the pure east-west geometry because that was picking up the cardinal axis, or the axis of the pyramids. So we're parallel to the pyramids in that direction. So if you take that line down, this dimension here along the front of the building is the same as from here to here. And then there was a formula so that could set out the entire grid. So we don't actually need to measure the grids. There's a formula that you can use to calculate it. But then kind of thinking about how do you experience the building. So, of course, Hatshepsut, this idea of layering. And I think one of the things that was important to us was that you don't just walk in the door and you kind of come out of, the heat, the noise, the intensity of Cairo, and you suddenly have Tutankhamun's mask in front of you, that there's some sense of progression, some sense of mediation to kind of allow you to calm down. And also a layering that we could use environmentally, very importantly. So all of the security is out of the road. And of course, there is a lot of security. You go through bag checks, all of that is out of the road. And then you go through this very, very grand it's kind of an arrival space. It brings you up to the facade. There's no planting in this area because it's the one place that you will eventually be able to see the full facade, because to either side it will be fully planted. So here is where you really get, in a way, the scale of the building. So you come up, you come into a courtyard, and you arrive into the middle. The museum proper is to one side, to the south, towards the pyramids, and the other side, there's a conference center. So this courtyard space is outside. It has a shaded roof, but it's environmentally an outdoor space. So you kind of move in through the facade. You come into this space. It's cooler because it's shaded. It's a little bit quieter because there's some screening. There's water in it. You're starting to kind of quieten down. There's a large statue of Ramses, which was moved from Tahrir Square, was moved onto the site before construction started, and then moved in during construction. In this image here, so the conference center is to the right, the museum proper is to the left. Now, The permanent exhibition galleries have a view towards the pyramids, which means that we had to get visitors up to the pyramid level. So that's essentially about 20 meters. So we knew we were going to have about 4 to 6 million people a year visiting. We wanted to have a very simple navigation. So we thought what we should do is have a large stair that brings visitors up the stairs, up to the top where they would see the pyramids, and then they start to move around the galleries. But rather than just having it as a stair, we could also use it as a way to bring visitors, if you like, from modernity, which is the courtyard, the bottom of the stair, and then have a sequence of pharaohs kind of to bring you back in time. Because at the top of the stair, you're at the Old Kingdom, because the pyramids are the Old Kingdom. So it's almost the beginning of the story. And then you start to move through the galleries. So you're moving along the chronological axis. We did have an issue with scale, I have to say, and we were working with West 8 on the landscape, and Adrian kept saying to us, you have no idea how big this building is, and he said to us, you have to draw on things you know. So we did go through a whole process of drawing in tennis courts, things that were measurable, but somebody, Wojciech in the office, he brought in a 747. You know, it really is a very, very large building. I mean, it is designed for a very large number of people, but that was, in a way, it's almost like an urban scale. So this is that stair. It is a very large stair, and in a way, we had to make it more than just climbing a stair. We had to make it an event, which is why that idea of that grand stair with the pharaohs as you move back. And in order to think about, the measurement of the stairs, we were looking at something like the Spanish Steps. We went to measure the stairs, but thinking as well as how high do you go in one flight? You know, if you only go up 1.5 meters, for most people, you still have within eye level the next landing, so it doesn't feel as overwhelming. So trying to make it a slow stair. So this is the stair as you go up, you arrive at the top of the stairs, you get the first view to the pyramids, Old Kingdom. Now, and it's not until this point that you actually go through a door. So you're still technically outside. So this is the environmental diagram. So you're going from natural, you have some AC coming back out through the stairs, but you're still technically outside. And it's not until you come to the galleries that you're in conditioned space. And then the very close control is through microclimate generators in the cases. And so this is the environmental diagram of the stairs. The galleries are actually, so the galleries themselves are quite large, 24,000 square meters. But if you remember, I said that the building is stepping up to the pyramids. So the galleries are also stepped. So just about 1.5 meter difference in level between them. So closest here to that wall, and then you step down and then back around. So we more or less aligned it to each of the kingdoms. So Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and then at the intermediate points where the, those kind of periods of disruption in between. So that's the diagram of it. This is some renderings, and I'll show you some images at the end. And that appears twice. So I'm going to go a little bit through, just, it's kind of, for me, it was kind of interesting thinking back on the journey. So this is kind of looking at what was happening in the world as we were working on it. So the day of the competition submission, it was actually, it was the day that the US issued an ultimatum to Iraq before the US, the war there. That was March 17th, 2003, which was a clue to me that we might win because that's St. Patrick's Day. So then the day we issued the tender set was September 26, 2008. And what was happening at that time in the world was the Lehman Brothers had collapsed. There was the beginning of the financial crisis. That had a huge impact on this project because the project was actually funded partially by a soft loan from Japan. So it was denominated in dollars, in yen, and Egyptian pounds. And all of those currency fluctuations had a big impact. What I haven't talked about was, in the meantime, we had built a conservation center on the site. So that photo on the left is a photo of that with some guys from our office. It's a very low-key building. It's a large building, 18,000 square meters, but that was built with all the conservation workshops because they did all of the work in advance, of course, of the collection moving into the main museum. Very significantly, though, for this project, in 2011, so we finished our tender drawings, but then there was a lot of review. There was a PMC being appointed. In 2011, there was a whole Arab Spring. President Mubarak, there was a revolution in Egypt. So Mubarak, and of course he was a very strong president in Egypt, so that was quite significant. The day of the construction award, the financial crisis was still going on in terms of the world. It was awarded on December 22nd, 2011. Construction started in 2012, and in Egypt there was an election and President Morsi was elected. But in 2013, when we were under construction, there was another revolt, and the Egyptian army ousted President Morsi. Then in 2014, President Sisi came into office. Construction was ongoing. So this photo obviously is taken in that entrance courtyard. What you're seeing in the foreground actually are the foundations for Ramses. In 2016, our facade was redesigned. So the facade that you see is not the one that we designed. So that was a bit traumatic for us. In January 2018, Ramses moved in. There was quite a lot of redesign that went in through the building. So the building was actually finished around Ramses. In 2020 then there was COVID, so the project was under construction, but obviously a lot of disruption, so still under construction, exhibition still needed to be installed. And you know, this is a huge exhibition. I mean, it's 24,000 square meters. When we started on the project, one of our museologists said the only comparable installation that was attempted in one go was the Getty, and they have such huge resources. And then it opened in November 1st, 2025. So this is the building as it is on opening. So there's that large entrance with the statue of Ramses II. Ramses II. So on the stairs, so you can see how the stairs was realized more or less as designed. So you can see that procession. I think one of the things, you can see how there's a lot of landings introduced, and that was really so that people had a place to stop, take a break. They can switch on to the travelators every 6 meters, so you don't ever have to go so far without having the opportunity to take a break. And of course, there are lifts provided. More photos, more images along the stairs. There's a travelator there you can see to the right, so you can continue on up. So, but you still haven't actually gone through a door. And then coming up to the top of the stairs, and this is where you have that view towards the pyramids. This particular photo I find interesting because this is the Queen Hatshepsut's collection. And what we're seeing here outside the window is Khufu's pyramid. Queen Hatshepsut was Khufu's mother. So what we were trying to bring these two things together, where you kind of situate this collection in this place, I think can be seen best in this image. So then some more more photos, you know, it's kind of stepping back from it. You can see that there's a lot of controlled natural daylight, partially because we were trying to minimize the energy use in the building, but also because a lot of the collection is pottery and stone, and then there is the opportunity to black out in other areas. And of course, Tutankhamun is completely blacked out. There's a view back to Cairo from this point here. This is a view looking back down the stairs. And there, of course, is the gold mask of Tutankhamun. It was kind of interesting, you just see the hint of daylight in behind because it hasn't been completely blacked out. And of course, it was a huge team that we worked with. So this is just in recognition of everybody who worked on the project. And thank you.
This is a little announcement to the audience. I know you're looking forward for all-women panel and fun panel, but we have a wild entry because unfortunately we have Sunita who's hurt her leg. Sujit, all yours.
I don't know if I should apologize, but yeah. I'd actually like to start by congratulating you all and my friends at Cadence for winning Mist. I think it's a yes, yeah. I got a glimpse of what you'd put in, thanks to Smaran, and it looks quite stunning. We're really looking forward to having this project here in Bangalore, so congrats. The presentations were fantastic and very different, Amrita, with diverse projects, a variety of approaches, and you know, beautiful 2 projects, taken a lot of time, a lot of rigor. 22 years, I counted, if my math's right. But yeah, it's quite stunning. And I wanted to start the conversation with you, Roisin, is just sort of stepping back a little bit, maybe, into the life of your practice. And if correct me if I'm wrong, you built the practice around a culture of competitions and pitches and what that might have been back then. And it's super interesting and fascinating, and I think it went on like that for a while until perhaps you mastered the idea of maybe what to perhaps put into a competition, or maybe understand what a brief or what parts of a brief might catch your attention, right? And this idea that you perhaps have put in something extremely radical, maybe as an entry for a competition, and then you're at this point where you have to deal with an evolving brief, and then the sort of whole maybe journey right after. Thought it'd be nice to talk to you about how that goes.
Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So we started years before the Egyptian Museum doing competitions when we came out of college. So we did a lot of ideas competitions, and I think we went 4 years without getting anything in anyone. So we won the very first one, an ideas competition in New York. And it was just and then of course that gives you a bit of energy. And then we did 4 years where we got absolutely nowhere with anyone. But I think what we started to learn was, when we looked at what people were doing, was that a lot of the time, those who won kind of had a clarity of idea. So it wasn't always about a detail, but it was a strong, clear idea that, if you like, then withstood, that had the ability to withstand a lot of change. I mean, generally, that would, so a lot of the time we also found, you know, when you look at the winners, a lot of the time you think, oh yeah, actually they kind of found something. So while it was a bit painful losing, but also you can learn a lot from it. And I think then kind of moving into practice, because then at a certain point we decided, okay, now we need to try. So we tried some real buildings and then won a few. And I think we say with the Egyptian Museum, I mean, that I put in that timeline because there was so much change in the world. And, you know, we weren't involved in the construction, so a completely different group of people built it. And there were changes, but still, like, a lot of the, if you like, the core ideas are there. So I think that's maybe what competition work does, that you tend to focus on things, and you have to anticipate change, because sometimes it's like you just never see it coming. Like COVID has changed the world in ways. You know, there are all these changes that you couldn't have imagined. So it's like, is there something there to hold on to that will allow everything else to change?
And what is it like now? I mean, is it? Do you still have that? Do you still do a lot of competitions, or?
Yeah,
yeah
we
okay,
still do.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, we need to have a client. We need to, yeah.
As it's just a follow-up question. As Sujit was saying, these two amazing projects had great processes and narrative. So I just want to ask you, are there, or what are the cues that you specifically look in the brief of a project? Or are there any cues, specific cues that you look in the brief before you get involved?
I think it's really trying to read it in detail. I mean, I think it's like we did in Mist, where you kind of just really pay attention to what is being asked in this case, and not necessarily bring all the stuff, not try to reproduce, because I think that's what we did here for Mist. We really paid attention to the site, what was being asked for, and then try to make something around that.
Same question for me. Yeah. I think our practice is built a little less on competitions, but we still do them. So it may not be as much of that, but I think we look for something we're going to connect to. Because it's very difficult to pour in the amount of energy and sort of passion into something that is a gamble, essentially. And I remember, you know, we had a conversation, because we've done competitions before together. We had a conversation when we got shortlisted, and there was this moment of like, can we really get this one? And we essentially put ourselves into that position where we say, actually, we'll only chase what we really want. And because you have to feel deeply passionate about the subject, the way the brief is written. You can often tell by the way a brief is written who is on the other side and who is likely to be the person that you'll be working with in some way. So you get a feel for the team through whether the brief has clarity, whether the brief has enough detail to say they know that this is likely to get it all the way through, because, you know, sometimes you work on a competition and the project may never happen because it wasn't organized in a way that was meant for it to. So seeing that kind of being able to identify the professionalism and the rigor that goes into the research and the way the brief is written suggests to us that that's something that will merit our time and energy in the same way. And our passion, because it is a huge gamble when you compete.
Amrita, I want to talk about your work a little bit more. And I was just, I mean, you can correct me if I've read this wrong, but I think in one of your talks a few years ago, I sort of on YouTube, I think you coined something, I think it was called contextual intelligence or something of that sort. And it was interesting, and you use the word inheritance here, and I think you like to sort of position your work as a sort of marker moment in a certain timeline, you know, in a certain context. And I was trying to understand this idea of continuity in the body of your work, because it feels like there's a, you talk about the architecture that needs to be cohesive with the context in some sense, but in, you know, the outcomes are actually quite provocative, and many of them, they are radical. Yeah. And because I know you've taken a stand that it's, you know, the pursuit is essentially contemporary, even though you go through these layers of conservation and preservation. What is your stand now? I mean, is it that the inheritance from the work you're putting in has to be something else now? So it feels like a kind of departure in that sense.
Yeah, I think it does have to be a it's not a departure. It's a consolidation. I don't think you have to resemble the past to dialogue with the past. I think you have to embrace it, acknowledge it, and then be able to innovate with it in a way. Like you have to innovate. We want to innovate. We want to create things that push boundaries, that are challenging how, and I don't mean even sort of innovate in a purely scientific way, because that does matter. I think improving the technologies we use to help our buildings perform better, last longer, you know, provide better comfort is really important, but that's table stakes today. I think what we're talking about is innovating with culture and innovating in a way that, you know, through history, I suppose you might call our work postmodern, but we are embracing that culture is a really important dialogue, and when you participate in its creation, you have to sort of further it. You don't just recreate versions of the past.
Yes, it's interesting because some of them are almost hybrid in nature. I mean, they coexist. I mean, the same project actually has
lots of
a terrific level of control, and then some of the moments feel liberated, you know, and in the same project. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that comes from it's a little bit what I was talking about, is that we're inheriting so much strata that is varied, and somewhere because we design interiors quite a lot, you learn the value of designing a room and the addition of rooms as entireties, but as small sort of like as micro projects within projects. And so, you know, like chapters in a book, you can actually write a really beautiful story within a room and then know that it will sit within a whole, but it doesn't have to entirely resemble the whole.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It's just again a follow-up. Your projects are so deeply in the context and the lived experience and almost tailored to the surroundings of whether it's a small insert or a small plot. So is contextuality is limiting you sometimes? No? And and not many architects involved, or the process is the same. For them, probably the context could be not necessarily physical or immediate context, but maybe form-driven or symbolic or perhaps ego. So where do you place, And sometimes projects need not come with strong context, and maybe not with the agenda, the cultural agenda. So what happens in those cases?
Do you want to answer that one? So I think the first question was, does context limit us? No, it actually is. It's the resistance band to our, like, it's what we need a creative friction as something to work with. So actually we really, I think we do better work in dense urban environments where we're interfacing a lot of criteria that are that we're dialoguing with. I think there's something fundamentally useful in that for us as a source of inspiration. It helps us guide why we're doing things, for whom, for how, in which situations, in which cultures, and also there's a temporality around it because, you know, the work architecture is slow. It's slow to realize. It's slow. I mean, maybe not in Bangalore because you guys go pretty fast, but it's slow where we come from, and there's a permanence about it. So we know that, you know, you're always designing knowing that it's hopefully going to last. But life continues around it, and it's pretty complex, and kind of keeping an eye on the way society is evolving, the cultures around work, the culture of how people relate to the work we do, how people live, how people, you know, travel, how people work, how all of those things are things that we have to keep an eye on, and I find that incredibly enriching as a process. I think your second question was more to do with what happens when you don't have constraint. And I didn't show those projects because I wanted to keep on theme for this particular talk. But there's no such thing as a blank sheet. We've worked on sites in Asia where we appear to be sort of dealing with an industrial sort of plot of land that absolutely is featureless and flat, and there's nothing near it. And we found that there are always constraints of some sort. Often those are coming from elsewhere. They're coming from the nature of the programming. They're coming from the nature of the subject. They can be environmental. You know, when I talk about inheritance, you also inherit landscape. Your project perfectly illustrated that, but we've also done work where what we're inheriting is landscape, and it has an immense power to shape, as has been wonderfully demonstrated by the Palestine Museum and others. So I'll let you take it from landscape, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think limitations are really opportunities, and actually, I think the fewer limitations, sometimes it doesn't give as much to work up against. So yeah, you might try to find limitations in other places, but I think it's sometimes in those difficulties that you can find the special thing about a project, because, you know, how do you find that moment where there is that thing that is just kind of click, and that's really specific to that project? That could be in the program, it can be in the site, it can come from different things, but I do think that limitations, we all need them, and they're there, but yeah.
I mean, something we've talked about, the three of us and our wider, like our partners and our teams, is that we really endeavour to create work that can only exist there, in that one place, for that one site. We have no, we're not pursuing, we're pursuing a theoretical clarity, but not a stylistic clarity. So we don't want to do the same project twice. It's not really the point. It's about, you know, knowing that something can only have come from that place, its context, its environment.
But it's interesting you said that as you were winding up that statement, and that I wanted to point to Roisin, is that would it be fair to say that you are in many ways interested in working with the ground? Because the two projects that you showed, and correct me, the Giant's Causeway, I think, is that, yeah, it's, there also there's a kind of preoccupation with operations on the ground.
Yes, yes. I think maybe it comes from maybe thinking about architecture or a place as not just the building, but that you have to think about how do you approach it, and inevitably you start to think about the ground when you do that. And I think in both, I mean, the Egyptian Museum came first, way before. And with that one, we just had this thing that you needed to have some kind of a mediation between Cairo. You know, Cairo is so intense, there's so much noise, that there needed to be some way to mediate, and therefore we needed to construct, it couldn't be just about this enormous building, that we needed to construct this sequence. Yeah, and the Giant's Causeway was very much the same, because in that case, you know, it was a much bigger landscape. So, yeah.
Just want to move to the way you all operate, because I think both of you are in several places at the same time, several cities, several countries. And just to understand the nature of your collaborations, I know you've collaborated with Cadence now, and this may be a slightly different context, but in general, in order to kind of ensure the clarity of the initial intent once you win a competition perhaps, or a commission outside of the home country, how do you kind of then ensure, what are the guidelines you put in place, and what is the sort of the hierarchies or the structures that you put in place to ensure that these projects are actually delivered the way you've conceived them, right?
I'll start. So we don't ever work where we work on a project in isolation from whoever we're collaborating with. So any project we've done where we've been successful, we've always worked with a team from day one. So I think as well that it gets richer, because there are certain insights you only have when there's somebody you're working with who knows that place. So we say with the Palestinian Museum, if they hadn't been picking up the time, and it didn't realize, because I suppose I had, in a way, the detachment of the outsider of it. I didn't know any of the food, but I suddenly could see the way that they all completely changed, and then we all went to dinner together, you know? It just, but I had that outsider's view that I could see there's a potential here, but I wouldn't have known that if I wasn't working with people, or we weren't working, or we say, yeah, so I think it's much richer. So we would not be, we would not really want to be working where we're handing things over. So we say working with Cadence, it wasn't a case, we all worked together, sometimes exhaustively.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, our collaborations begin right at the beginning before there's any pen to paper. It actually begins first with figuring out that we have a synergy, that there's a chemistry between, everybody who's joining a team, and that we know that this is going to be a solid friendship that kind of exists above a project, and things will happen afterwards as well. So all of our work is really about, I guess I kind of explained it. It's about relationship building and negotiating solutions together. So we, with regards to working internationally, we try to be really insightful when we conceive a project, that it should be something that is suited to the construction industries of a place. It's suited to, the climate, the culture, the things that really make, there's no point in sort of enforcing a way of thinking. I mean, our whole, I feel like I had years of education, years of working for other people, and then I spent all the years that we've been working for ourselves unlearning all that bias and unlearning all the baggage that I was sort of effectively relearning how, you know, how to do things today in a world which is much more digitally nomadic. We can work from many places. We collaborate with teams online. We actually feel that we have a lot of oversight around, you know, it's a process that we share. The intent is held not just by ourselves, but by everyone on the team, including engineers, including, you know, in some cases, other designers, etc. So there's always this sense of a shared sense of a project rather than one that we are sort of imposing an intent on someone, if that makes sense.
Amrita, your practice spans across scales, as we saw, from furniture to lighting to now working on urban scales and different geographies. So how does design methodologies, do they change every time you pick up scales, or do you have your principles or something constant, what you believe in, or how does that?
In terms of scale?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think...
in terms of design methodologies,
yeah.
how do you go about it?
So I think I should, I mean, Michelle and I are, I mean, we have a team, and we, you know, our team has a range of different skills. As we do have interior designers and urban designers, etc., within our team. And Michelle and I have diverse interests ourselves, so actually there's quite an enriching process. I have a background in urban design, so I tend to think big picture and macro, and you know, the city is really my great space of passion. Michelle has a strong sense of that, but I guess it's not his real space of interest. He's much more a pure architect. There's a lot of work that but he has an intense amount of understanding of product design, of you know, branding. Actually, Michelle designs everything. He could design everything, like apps, TV shows, I don't know. There's no limit. And I think somewhere it's coming from thinking about everything as a design opportunity. So, and we don't really have a clear, I would say, methodology, but we tend to observe life very closely, how things get used, why things get used, how things get organized, and that's why, you know, Michelle somehow, he's spearheaded a lot of the product and furniture design, but he's also spearheaded a lot of that energy research. So, you know, it's that observation of being able to look at life, look at the challenges, sort of being able to observe and see the realities that fuel security was becoming a problem. A war was about to begin, and he saw an opportunity to, you know, create, to use our skills as architects, as being thinkers that pull together so many different disciplines, to effectively start a project which would otherwise sit outside of our discipline. So that's him.
Just another question to both of you. It looks like there's a clear evolution in the practice from 14 years and 22 years, if I'm correct. Yeah. So my question is, how have your internal priorities changed, especially you, Amrita? And what, if you have to go back in time, is there a project that you want to do it differently? Because maybe the importance, something else has taken precedence in your practice, and what is that?
Do you want to answer that first? I need to think.
I think, what will I see? Maybe, well, probably become a little bit more cognizant of maybe what we're asking in terms of construction, maybe a bit more, I mean, you know, over the years as well, I think in terms of building, there's becoming a lot more focus on the embodied energy, and therefore what, you know, what might be asked in terms of structure, what are the carbon impacts on that. So I think we've become a lot more aware. So I suppose more a focus on moving maybe to applying the same kind of thought that we would have given to competition to building.
I won't answer it as eloquently because I think it might be more of a personal reflection. I think I will answer a slightly different thing. In hindsight, I think I would have liked to have said no to some things, and I said no to nothing because when you're hungry, you take it all on and you figure it all out. But I think we might have done some work that may have it would have paid bills, but it would have taken time and thinking away from the possibility of pursuing other versions of our practice, which we're very interested in pursuing. And I think we probably didn't make space for competitions and things as much in probably the first 6 to 7 years of practice, because we just felt like we were, we were just trying to stay alive, mostly. And we wanted to build really well, and that took a lot of energy to sort of, have that much oversight over the details of everything we were building. And I think, in hindsight, we probably should have stepped back from some things.
I have many more questions, but I think since we're running out of time, it'd be good to sort of throw the discussion open to the audience. If there's somebody who wants to ask a question, and then maybe we look to wrap up. It's also getting quite late, so anyone who wants to ask, maybe something specifically on the mist, perhaps. Smaran can take a question, maybe.
I just because you said Bangalore, how's your understanding been so far about the city, and how do you feel? What's the
when you say understanding of the city?
I think it's the competition is interesting because it's you're dealing with maybe much shorter histories, right? It seems like something you're looking at Bangalore through the lens of innovation, startups, and so on. So it's more for the present and the future, and I don't know if that has a precedent in that sense, right? I mean, except for the fact that it was the structure that you're building into has some history, but otherwise, in terms of what it's actually showcasing, is more for the present and the future, isn't it? Is that a fair way to look at it?
Well, I think one of the things that was kind of interesting for me was the way that all of that work that has come to fruition now, you can see the seeds of it being planted around independence with, the investments that are made in different, engineering. So somehow the layering of that work now coming to fruition. So for me, that was kind of interesting because kind of systematically, you kind of think, I think because democracies tend to have a 5-year window from rolling from election to election. So sometimes those kind of long-term investment decisions that actually don't pay off, like investments in university or focus in, it doesn't pay off a lot of the time for 2 or 3 generations. Yeah. And I found it really interesting to see actually how certain decisions, and maybe sometimes paths not taken, but how it kind of has contributed to where Bangalore is now. So in a way, I maybe came into it thinking this is an immediate story, but actually realizing, no, this is actually a layering up. And I'm thinking, there's a lot of lessons there for other places, because I think so many places have it, we think in a short time frame.
I mean, I absolutely second that. I think what we came into a project thinking that it was going to be about the future of innovation, things that are happening now, and the incredible powerhouse that Bangalore is. Like I've sort of spent a lot of my childhood in the north, like traveling to the north of India, and I just, it's like another India. It's a full discovery for me to sort of, also maybe because I hadn't been to India for some years before I came, It's incredibly vibrant, dynamic. I mean, there's so much going on here. We've sort of driven around and looked at some of the architecture and the things that are happening, and it feels like you're on a cultural pulse right now, which is so exciting. So, you know, it's like coming into a place and feeling so much energy has been really it's inspiring to sort of participate on this project. But also, it did feel like our research on this project has shown us that this was something that it was a long history. Like, it's not a short story, it's actually quite a long story, and which somewhere begins with India's independence, but, you know, there's even other things. And I think, as a child of the diaspora, like, it's one that I feel like very linked to, because my parents are engineers. You sort of hear, you know, these things, like you learn about something that you kind of vaguely understood in a much more studied way, which has really resonated and is very exciting to sort of see where Bangalore is now and
that's great.
what's coming.
Yeah. I think we'll wind up. Thank you very much, Roisin, and thank you, Amrita. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.
We have to do some more thank yous. Siddharth, Ambika, and Bikram are here. They are our sponsors. We have to thank them. It's unconditional with them, so I don't know where they are. Somewhere here. Yeah, okay, yes. Okay. Thank you very much. We have a little token for you. Siddharth, if you can please. Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you. That's Siddharth from the Quattrolux team. Yeah. They back all our events. And thank you, everyone here. Thank you for staying back. I know we've now, this has become a pattern, like Smaran said. But I hope you're enjoying these events, and we'll make the announcement for the next one soon. Thanks so much.
And please follow us on Insta. Last minute decisions you'll get to know fast. Please follow us. Good night.